On behalf of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies here at the University of Denver, I'd like to welcome everyone here today. This is our official first event for the spring quarter, and it's a huge honor and privilege for me personally to have Dr. Chris Giannou as our first guest speaker. At a very sort of young and impressionable age, Dr. Giannou's life story made a huge impression on me, deeply shaped my own sort of thinking and view of the world. Growing up in Canada, if you were interested in questions of social justice, of global affairs, and if you were around and alive in the late 1980s and 1990s reading the news, you could not have missed and been influenced by the life work of Dr. Giannou. Not only is he a leading war surgeon, operating and working in different countries around the world, changing in many ways the world, one patient at a time, one operation at a time. His insights on the societies and countries where he's worked are profoundly important. One of the things that most people who know Dr. Giannou agree upon is that not only is he an expert in war surgery, but he is really a public intellectual, a man who not only practices war surgery, but knows the politics, history, society, and economics of the countries in which he works in. And so in that sense, having him here today to talk about one particular part of the developing world where he has a special, I think, expertise and insight is the case of the Arab Islamic world, where he has spent many years of his life deeply involved in not only the area of healthcare, but also the politics of these societies. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity, given that he's on campus today, to give a keynote talk for the conference that our friends in the Center on Rights and Development are having. That's tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, to bring him here to have a Center for Middle East Studies sort of event. And given the changes that have been taking place in the Arab Islamic world related to the Arab Spring, to have a chance to pick Chris Giannou's brain, to sort of get him to share with us the wealth of insight and ideas that he has about the challenges facing the Arab Islamic world. And so we're going to have a public conversation for about maybe 30, 40 minutes. Then we will turn it over to the audience and allow you to sort of ask him some questions, and that should take us, right to the end of the program. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Giannou to the University of Denver. So Chris, a huge honor to have you here today. The title of this event is The Failure of the Post-Colonial State. And so the first sort of broad question that I have for you, I'd like you to sort of reflect upon, is really answer the big question: what went wrong? Many of us, many people had these huge aspirations that with the ending of the era of colonialism and imperialism, and with indigenous leaders coming to power in these societies, that there would be opportunities for serious sort of development, for growth, for higher standards of living. But looking back over the last 50, 60 years of the post-colonial era, in the case of the Arab world, 22 Arab states, and all of them, with the exception of Tunisia, dictatorships, failed political models, failed economic models. And that sort of poses the question, what went wrong? What were in your estimation, given your study, living, thinking, reading on this part of the world, what would be the key sort of factors that you would highlight as being sort of instrumental in explaining the crisis of state and societies today in the post-colonial Arab Islamic world?
Okay. Thank you, Nadav. Good morning, all. You've probably read through some of my curriculum vitae. I've worked with the Palestine Red Crescent, Canadian Red Cross, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Obviously, what I have to say today does not represent at all the official policy of those three institutions. They are my own personal opinions. And now that I'm officially retired from all of these institutions, I do have the freedom to speak out. First of all, correction. Tunisia is not the only non-dictatorship in the Arab world. You have Lebanon, which could be called an illiberal democracy. Northern Africa, the Middle East, Western Asia, of course, is an area of the world that has millennia of history, of written history. And therefore, to answer any modern topic, one really has to refer to certain historical facts. It's 100 years since the beginning of the First World War. And with the First World War, of course, we have the end of 4 different empires. The Habsburg, Austro-Hungarian, the Hohenzollern in Imperial Germany, Tsarist Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. With the end of the Ottoman Empire, you have the end also of the Caliphate. And shortly thereafter, in the 1920s, you have establishment of first modern states in the Middle East. You have Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. You have Saudi Arabia. The Ibn Saud tribe throws out the Sharif of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, and establishes a modern state. You have, of course, Iran. And Iran, slightly before the First World War, of course, already went into a constitutional monarchy, and 1906, a very, very modern and liberal constitution was implemented. So you have those 3 modern sort of states. You have a medieval state in Yemen, an Ibadite form of Shia Islam monarchy. And the rest of the Middle East, the Arab world, is under one form of colonial mandate trusteeship, whether it's the League of Nations or not. You do have Afghanistan, which also independent, was not colonized, a buffer state between the British Empire, the British Raj of India, and Tsarist Russia. And again, a monarchy. Now, what happens is, after the First World War, you have a division of this Middle East by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Sykes, British Foreign Minister, Picot, French Foreign Minister, and at the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, they divide up the Middle East. The Balkans also are broken up into fledgling nation states. And I would say that a great deal of the problems of the post-colonial state is the inability of the international community to manage the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, whether it's the Balkans, whether it's the Middle East. So we have Sykes-Picot, we have the Balfour Declaration of the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. I would maintain that today Sykes-Picot is caduc, is dying as an agreement. Balfour still lives. Northern Africa is under one form or another of colonial administration, direct colonial. Algeria was considered a part of France, a department of France. There was a protectorate over Tunisia and Morocco. Italy, Mussolini's Italy, had invaded and colonized Libya. So what we find going into the 1920s and 30s is an entire region, a few states that are more or less independent, and some trying to modernize, such as Turkey, Afghanistan, modernizing monarchs who were fought by villagers. The same occurs years later, whether Afghanistan was a monarchy, a republic, a Marxist, or a NATO-occupied country. You have a centralizing, modernizing state that is fought by villagers. And under the rhetoric of Islam, in effect, ascribe more to Pashtunwali, the honor code of the Pashto, the Pathans. And that explains a great deal of struggle with Mujahideen and today's Taliban and so forth in Afghanistan. But nonetheless, it's an independent country. Saudi Arabia, of course, an obscurantist medieval monarchy that practices probably one of the most extremely conservative forms of Islam, Wahhabi, and whose influence is increasing because they are financing madrasas, schools across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and promoting their version of Islam. Now, what one must remember in the 1920s or 30s is, in reaction to this colonial phenomenon, you have 2 large ideological currents that arise. One is Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, in the 1920s. And even in the 30s and 40s, even in Algeria with Sheikh Ibrahim bin Bedis and the Algerian ulema. And in the fight against French colonialism in Algeria, it was bin Bedis who said, Algeria is my country, it's not France. Arabic is my religion, not French. Teaching of Arabic was prohibited in Algeria. You wanted to learn Arabic, you had to go to Tunisia or Morocco. And Islam is my religion. So you have the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East, you have Ibrahim bin Bedis, and they refuse the colonial chopping up of the Arab Muslim world. And large ideological current is for the re-establishment of the caliphate. And this is not new. It goes back to the 1920s and 30s. There is a second current in reaction to colonialism, which is a secular modernizing current. Broadly speaking, Pan-Arabism. Now, whether afterwards of the Abdel Nasser sort, whether the Baathists also is 1939, 1940, the Qawmin, Arab nationalists, or in the case again in North Africa, Algeria, Messali Hajj in France, with the Étoile du Nord, l'Afrique du Nord, which was a working class movement in the Algerian diaspora in France. So you have on the one hand Islam, on the other hand you have a secular, modernizing current that wanted to take what they could from Western civilization in terms of modernity, but maintain an Arab-Muslim character, much in the same way that if you go to East Asia, you'll find Japan modernizes, accepts Western technology, but remains Japanese culture, Japanese traditions. China, all right, socialism with Chinese characteristics. And this is a common reaction to the colonial phenomenon. How do we modernize and yet still remain true to our origins, our culture? Now, the Islamic current and the secular current often fought each other. I reread the biography of Hafid al-Assad by Patrick Seal, a British journalist, recently. It was written 20 years ago. And it's the history of modern Syria. And in the 30s and 40s, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Baathists and communists, on the other hand, were fighting in the streets. They were fighting each other. And people were being killed. Now, neither was in power at the time. It was still under French domination. But there were street battles. So what is happening in Syria today is actually nothing new. And what we see through the 1940s and then the 1950s with decolonization, the Algerian War of Independence, and then as well as the independence of Tunisia and Morocco, and in the Middle East, the establishment of independent countries in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Transjordan, becomes Jordan after 1948, the revolution in Egypt, overthrow of the monarchy. Shortly thereafter, the revolution in Libya. Gaddafi overthrows the monarchy. So what you have is a major push, again, during a period now of the Cold War, of the secular current, with its different permutations. So Abdel Nasser, while receiving assistance from the Soviet Union, is putting communists in prison. And the Baathists, both in Iraq and in Syria, at one time or another are allied to the communists and other Arab socialist parties, but they also end up putting the communists and other socialists in prison. both are challenged by Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood are put into prison and executed and tortured and so forth. Throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in effect, it's the secular current that predominates. Arab socialism and so forth, and non-aligned movement. And what basically happens is they really wanted to be non-aligned. They were abandoned by the West. Because the logic of the Cold War, the United States and Western Europe saw that any radical nationalism, which is also anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, was anti-Western, and therefore objectively was allied to the Soviet Union. The story of the building of the Aswan Dam in Egypt is perhaps the epitome of this. Abdel Nasser sought financing from the United States, which was refused, and so he turned to the Soviet Union. The same thing with weapons procurement. And what you have is a polarization during the Cold War that pushes the secular modernizing current in the Arab Muslim world towards the Soviet Union. And I mean modernizing. I attended 4 different universities for various reasons. McGill, and then Algiers, and Angers in France, and then Cairo. I graduated in 1975 from Cairo University medical faculty. In 1975, 50% of my graduating class were women. 50%. And that's 1975. In the United States, how many women were at medical school in 1975? Not many. When my graduating class was 50% women. So there was an attempt at modernity and an attempt at social justice. Again, a reaction to colonialism, with the idea that to be just, one had to be socialist. I mean, most of the world does believe in social democracy. The United States is a particular exception. People believe that economic rights and freedoms go along with political rights and freedoms. And this is especially the case if you have been oppressed by a colonialism that was basically racist. All right? They treated people as niggers and wogs. And therefore the reaction to that is, well, it's not just the white people. We're also human beings, and we want a social justice. We do not want to repeat the same forms of oppression. They end up doing that, because that's also the logic of certain type of economic development. And what you have is this modernity is brought to a sudden halt by the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, with the crushing of the Arab armies in a matter of days. Now, before that, the 1956 war, which pitted Israel against Egypt, but Israel aided by the British and the French. And we know that after that, again, what provoked it was the nationalization of the Suez Canal. So again, an anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist phenomenon to try to gain greater economic independence for Egypt. And this was after Egypt managed to get rid of British military presence for the first time in almost 100 years from Egypt. And that was seen in the Arab world as a great victory for Abdel Nasser, even though militarily he was defeated. Managed to maintain control of the Suez Canal, and it greatly increased the influence of this current of thinking of modernization, Arab socialism, non-alignment, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism. With the 67 war, that's defeated, and that ideology is defeated. Not only in Egypt, but also in Syria, the Baathists. And after that period, what you have is a decline in the modernization process. The regimes that already were autocratic become more and more simple military dictatorships. And over the last 10 or 15 years, those simple military dictatorships, or in the case of Iraq and Syria, a party dictatorship, became more and more a clan and family dictatorship. So that in Iraq, under the last 10 years of Saddam Hussein, it was the Takriti clan, and no longer the Ba'ath Party, that really ruled the country. In Syria, even till today, it's the close family, not the Alawi, but the close family of Bashar al-Assad. His brothers, his brother-in-law, cousins, etc. The same phenomenon occurred in Egypt under Mubarak. The same in Tunisia under Ben Ali. It becomes, and Tunisia was not a military dictatorship. The army was always very weak. It was a police state. But it becomes a family dictatorship. And these so-called modernizing regimes, well, take a look at Syria. Hafez al-Assad dies, and who becomes president? You have a dynastic republic. The son becomes president. And because he's not yet 40 years of age, you even have to change the constitution in order to allow the son to become president. Which means this whole modernity of republic versus monarchy is bankrupt. And we're no longer talking about Arab socialism and social justice. We're talking about neoliberal policies, economic policies, privatizations. And who benefits? The close family members of the people in power. So the secular current is bankrupt. And what's left for people? Islam and the Islamic current. And that's the case whether it's Tunisia with the Nahda, Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood, in Iraq, it's not the Muslim Brotherhood because the majority of the population is Shias, but influenced by the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And in Syria, the original non-violent opposition to the regime was a mixture. Liberals, Democrats, communists, socialists, and Muslim brothers. Very quickly, it's the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood that takes control and begins the militarization and then loses control. And so you have the different foreign jihadis who arrive under the Jabhat al-Nusra and the ISIS. I have to translate it, but anyway, the Levant in Iraq jihadis, Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda affiliated. They now have the military upper hand in the opposition to the regime. But it begins mostly with the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's a repeat of what happened in the 1940s and 50s. And then, of course, the revolt of Hama in 1982, when Hafez al-Assad basically razed the city of Hama, killing 10 to 20,000 people. So the only thing remaining in terms of a reaction now to no longer the injustice of colonialism, but the injustices of the post-colonial state, where the same mechanisms of oppression of the people were simply now repeated by a local national elite, bourgeoisie. And the revolt today is in the name of Islam. Now, if you sit down and talk to these people, and I'm not talking about the Al-Qaeda affiliated, I'm talking about a mainstream political Islam. If you sit down and talk to them, they will basically say, we're anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, we want social justice. And 30 years previously, those same people would have been in the Communist Party. or a socialist party. Because the little people in the movement want that same thing. They simply say, well, we're no longer going to do it through modernization, we're going to do it through Islam. We want social justice, economic justice. We want dignity. We do not want to be oppressed by a police state. We do not want to be tortured and executed. And we're still anti-colonialist. So the failure of the post-colonial state throughout the region is largely a failure of a certain type of modernization. The third alternative to that is simply, well, let's accept the Western values, even today, of neoliberalism, and let's make money. Now that works for a minority. It does not work for 99% of the population. And if modernity is simply the equivalent of the consumer society, then it's a very, very poor modernization. Because modernity in Western Europe, beginning 2-3 centuries ago, is a slow development of the rule of law. The separation of state and religion. Rule by law and not rule by personalities. Now, that's a problem not only in the Middle East and Northern Africa. I'm of Greek origin and I live today in Greece. Well, the post-Ottoman state in Greece is the same. There's no rule of law, it's a rule of personalities. We still have not separated state and religion. We still have problems with language. We have a classical ancient Greek. We have a modern clean Greek, katharevousa, and we have a popular Greek. These are, in Arabic you have classical Arabic of the Quran, you have a modern standard Arabic, you have local vernaculars. Iran, you have an old Persian, you have a modern Persian. In Turkey, there has been a cultural revolution linguistically under Ataturk, no longer written in Arabic script, written in Latin script. Many words, foreign words were removed, etc. In effect, what you have is an ongoing renaissance. And many of these questions, also constitutional, monarchy or republic, that Europe went through over several centuries, Renaissance and Enlightenment up to the modern, creating the modern era and modernization, meant that you created different social institutions. Whether it's Greece, whether it's ex-Yugoslavia, the Balkans, again, post-Ottoman Empire, whether it's the Middle East, North Africa, we've not managed to do that. And the result is that for many people today, modernization is simply the consumer society. So you see people in the streets, whether it's Athens, Beirut, Alexandria, or Algiers, and they dress like Europeans. They appear even to act like Europeans. The image of women in the Arab world, all of them wearing a scarf over their heads or a burqa or chador, etc., is rubbish. There's a great deal more of it today than 25 years ago. But a very common scene, not even Beirut, Saida in southern Lebanon, two sisters sitting at an outdoor cafe. One covered, the second wearing a miniskirt. And they're having coffee and ice cream out of an outdoor cafe. And they're sisters. Now that apparent contradiction is all about a society going through the convulsions of modernization. When I was in medical school in the 70s in Cairo, and just in 79, therefore just after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, more and more women started wearing the hijab. It was still a very small minority. But many of them said, wearing the hijab gives me freedom, because I'm no longer a sex object. And when you look at the sexualization of adolescents in America or Europe, even pre-adolescence, the sexualization of little girls, well, that's obviously demeaning, in my opinion. I mean, I'm a feminist. I'm actually a radical feminist. And I find it demeaning. And I really don't like seeing, women's underwear, their string and this and that, because their jeans are halfway down to their knees. Because I think that's demeaning, and I don't think it's an expression of freedom. It's an expression simply of the prison of consumer society and marketing. So, if you are a non-Western woman and you want to be modern, and you want to be considered as a human being and not as a sex object, then one way is to wear the hijab. Now, there's also a great deal of hypocrisy behind wearing the hijab. But I also understand the explanation of certain women that, this way men are obliged to deal with me as a human being, with a brain, with ideas. And again, as I said, this is the challenge of modernization. How do you modernize without losing your traditions? How do you become Japanese? And the Arab Muslim world has not been able to find that. Neither through the secular modernizing currents of thought, of ideologies, neither through Islam, nor simply, well, let's accept Western values in the consumer society. So they're at a sort of dead end. Now, the other problem of the post-colonial state is the same with all post-colonial states throughout Africa and everywhere else, and that's the legitimacy. The legitimacy of the state. Look at Africa and the Middle East. Look at the map. Most of the borders are straight lines. Take a look at the map of the United States. What's the difference between the original 13 colonies and all of the Midwest and West? Straight lines. The 13 colonies are all a little wiggly, all right? Once you get beyond that, what you have is straight lines. Because what you have is a number of bureaucrats sitting in an office far away from the human reality who draw lines on a map. Now, in the United States, you don't really have a problem with the legitimacy of Colorado versus Wyoming or New Mexico or California, etc. But in Africa and the Middle East, there is a problem of legitimacy. What do these straight lines mean for us who have thousands of years of history? Trade routes that go thousands of kilometers over millennia. The human reality on the ground. One could say that in the Arab world, North Africa, Middle East, etc., there's really only one or two places that have any sort of legitimacy in terms of a nation or state creation. The Nile Valley, Egypt. Because Egypt is the Nile Valley. The rest is desert. So where you draw the lines on a map really doesn't make any difference. For millennia, Egypt has been the Nile Valley. And although it's been invaded and occupied many times, the genius of the Egyptian people has always been to incorporate the invaders and make them Egyptian. So Egypt has a legitimacy as a state. And the rest? Libya is in danger of falling into three parts, being divided up. Tunisia was basically Tunis. Algeria, well, the East is not the West, is not Algiers. Morocco, the only thing that gives Morocco as a state legitimacy is the monarchy. Sharif, because the family supposedly descends from the Prophet Muhammad. Mesopotamia, what then became Iraq, but Iraq, modern Iraq, was totally artificial. The British took 3 different vilayat of the Ottoman Empire, stuck them together, and said, this is Iraq. I forgot to add a 4th, Kuwait. And therefore, when Saddam Hussein says, what was Kuwait? He's not wrong. He puts into question the legitimacy of something called Kuwait. How about Bahrain and Qatar? And do they have any historical legitimacy as states? And this is how people in the region look at these countries. Because these states are the creation, not of the indigenous peoples. They are the creation of the imperialists and the colonialists, who sat down in an office somewhere in London or Berlin, etc., and drew lines on maps and divided the region up for their own interests. In the United States, here there's a large Arab community. The oldest Arab community in the United States are Christians, mostly Greek Orthodox, some Maronites, who call themselves Syrians and then Syro-Lebanese, because 100 years ago there was no Lebanon. There was Jebel Lubnan, the Lebanese mountain, which is a very small part of modern Lebanon. Modern Lebanon was creation of the French. They stuck together a few cities and a few mountains and etc., and they said, Lebanon, greater Lebanon. And the rest, Syria. The British had one king too many. So they had to create Jordan, Transjordan. But historically, there was nothing called Jordan, Transjordan. I mean, the royal family, the Sharifs, were expelled from Mecca and Arabia by Ibn Saud. The sons of the Sharif Hussein arrived British. They put one on the throne in Iraq. They put another. And then, just a minute, I've got another son. Well, let's chop off a piece and we'll call it Transjordan. Now, historically, what do you have? Petra in Jordan. Nabatean. A civilization, a culture that's thousands of years old. Right up to the Christian era, so you have churches carved into the stone. And it's the best, tourist spot in modern Jordan. But that has nothing to do with modern Jordan. And therefore, what is the legitimacy of Jordan today? The monarchy. Why? Beni Hashim. It's the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. That's the official name. And Hashemite is the tribe of the Prophet. A religious legitimacy. But not a legitimacy as a nation state. So the idea of these post-colonial states not being legitimate and the reaction to colonialism was, well, let's unify all of this. And you either unify it through Pan-Arabism or through Islam. One of the two. And there are different variations. With the end of the Cold War, a good deal of the, let's say, the balancing act of the elites in the Arab world comes to an end. There is no longer a Soviet Union to play off against the United States. Because that was the basic idea of non-alignment. And it was not just the Arab world, it was not just Nasser. It was Nehru in India, it was Makarios in Cyprus, and it was Tito in Yugoslavia. It was Sukarno in Indonesia. And then it became 100 and some odd countries, the non-aligned movement. And the idea was, we do not want to be in a military alliance with the West or with the Soviet Union, but basically we want to milk both for our own benefit. Well, I mean, we've been exploited by these people for so many years. Why should we not milk them a bit? The non-aligned movement basically comes to an end because there's no longer anything to counterbalance the United States and the West and NATO. So what do? Well, you cooperate. You open up your markets. In certain countries, of course, the British, French, and Americans, for the Soviets, had already been training the secret police. I mean, the KGB, the Stasi, and so forth, trained the secret police in Egypt and in Syria, in Iraq, and the Americans trained them, and the British and the French elsewhere. Well, we no longer have that, so now we all go to the Americans and the British and the French to train our secret police. And we open up our markets. And after the 11th of September, if you really want to torture somebody, you give him to us. Rendition. So the United States does not like Bashar al-Assad. How many people the CIA give over to the Assad regime in Syria so that they could be tortured? There's one very famous case, actually. Syrian immigrant to Canada. Maher Arar. On his way back from a vacation in Europe, passes through New York on his way to Toronto. And in New York, he's picked up. He's still in transit. The United States authorities asked the RCMP in Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which often acts like the Royal Canadian Mounted Gestapo, and he's taken back to Jordan and then handed over to the Syrians. And he's tortured for a year. And the Syrians, basically, after a year of torture, say, he's not Al-Qaeda. We've got nothing on him. Mixed up of names or something. They release him. He gets back to Canada, and he sues the Canadian government. With reason. And he's given $12 or $13 million in compensation. He tries to sue the American government, and they refuse to take it before the courts of law because national security does not allow it. Because you would have to give up certain information in national security. And the great division of powers in the United States disappears. And when the courts are faced with questions of national security, there's no division of power. Now, if you are an ordinary citizen in any country, in the Arab world, in Africa, in the third world, makes no difference. When you see this happening, what is your reaction? Put yourself in the place of a citizen living in the Congo, or Brazil, or Iraq, or Egypt, or Algeria, and look at this through their eyes. We have authoritarian regimes that are screwing over the people with the aid and assistance and acquiescence of the hypocrites in America and Europe. After the 11th of September, certain people in this country, including your president, Bush the Younger, said they hate us for our values. That's why they attacked us. He was wrong. They love you for your values. They hate you for your hypocrisy because you do not live up to your values. And the vast majority of the American public have absolutely no idea of what their government does in their names around the world. You have to read. Ex-CIA agents, Bachevich, others, who will tell you what the United States has done around the world. And as a consequence, in the failure of the post-colonial state, what we have also is a failure of the powerful, the West. The Soviets went bankrupt, they imploded. The West is going bankrupt. The economic crisis of 2008, I mean, some people would say the Soviet Union collapsed before the West collapsed, that's all. But we're on our way as well. And the rest of the world watches this and says, well, you, the powerful, all you do is support now no longer the foreigners who are oppressing us. You are supporting our local elites who are oppressing us. Throughout the Cold War, don't forget, Europe and the United States supported the obscurantist medieval monarchy of Saudi Arabia against the modernizing forces of Egypt and other countries. You supported the Mujahideen against the Marxists in Kabul. Now, the Marxists in Kabul were not very Marxist. And the basic reason the Soviet Union had to intervene was a civil war within the Afghan Communist Party, the Afghan Democratic Party. There were two groups, Parcham and the Khalq. And there was a civil war between the two factions. They were killing each other. The Soviets basically invaded to put an end to the civil war within the party. And the party told people, well, you should not marry off your daughters at the age of 12. Wait until they're 16. And until then, send them to school. Now, King Aman Allah had tried it in the 1920s, the Republic had tried it, etc., but the villagers revolted. And through the Mujahideen, you and Europe supported the Mujahideen. Now, the first time I went to Afghanistan was 1993 with the International Committee of the Red Cross. There was still no Taliban. Kabul had been destroyed because of the infighting between Mujahideen factions. And a young surgeon came to see me, a woman, an Afghan female surgeon, who had just finished 8 years doing her medicine and surgery training in Cuba. So 8 years of Cuban socialism, rum, salsa, and screwing around. And she arrives in Kabul, and a year later, the Najibullah regime falls, and the Mujahideen are there, and she's asking me, what do you think I should do? Should I stay? Should I leave? I said, well, you can stay because the head surgeon of the military is Dr. Sohaila Sadiq, a woman surgeon, member of the Central Committee of the party. And under the Marxist regime and the Soviet presence, she gave orders to the Soviet surgeons in the military hospital. Now, this is a tough lady. The Mujahideen respected her so much, even if she was a communist. They respected her so much that she was left as, remained head surgeon of the Afghan army. It was the Taliban who removed her. But Sohaila, smart woman, said to the Taliban, you have wives and children, don't you? Where are you going to treat them, have them treated if they fall ill? Now, the military hospital in Kabul is a large, large complex with many buildings. She took over one, renovated it, took all of the female staff, and ran a hospital within a hospital for women and children. I gave her several boxes of instruments, etc., etc. The main hospital, there were 100 surgeons and 100 nurses, all of them male. The 600 female nurses had been thrown out. So Sohaila was still there as head surgeon of the Afghan military. And so I told this young female surgeon, I said, well, take her as an example. She's remained here, even out of the Mujahideen. Now that's important for a very simple reason. Since the American invasion and occupation and NATO occupation of Afghanistan, what have you been told?
We're there to save women.
We're there to save women from the Taliban, etc. Except the women were far more advanced under the Marxists than they are even today. Now, again, as I said, the Marxists were not very Marxist. They were also corrupt, and they had their nomenclatura and everything else, etc., etc. All right, and they practiced a police state, torture and executions, etc. But there were also discotheques in Kabul, and there were women wearing miniskirts. Today, under NATO, there are no miniskirts. And under the Taliban, these terrible people, they actually managed to stop opium production. Today, you have a narco state under the very noses of NATO. And these are the people that are going to help Afghan society to modernize. Believe me, everybody throughout the Middle East and Africa is watching this. And they really don't worry very much of the kind of modernization that you try to push down people's throats.
Chris, let me turn to the audience and see if they have any questions. The floor is open if you want to ask any questions of Chris Giannou. Yeah, go ahead.
Firstly, I want to compliment you.
Loud enough so that people in the
I
back
want to
can hear.
compliment you on a remarkable recitation of what has been evil over the past 100 years in international politics. You have nailed it. How do we overthrow the regime in the United States?
Well, you can begin with the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, my reading of it, is not that you have guns at home to protect yourself against criminals. It's that in a well-ordered militia, so that you can fight the crown if there's any attempt to reimpose the monarchy on the American people. Correct?
Supreme Court says that.
Pardon?
The Supreme Court says that.
Well, you know, I mean, the country was also based on a certain Protestant ethic, and in Protestantism, everybody reads their own interpretation of the Bible. And you've got more than enough born-again Christians in this country, and evangelicals, etc., who believe in their own reading of the Bible, so you can probably read the Constitution yourself. That's the right of a citizen. Now, I'm not, before I get into trouble with the FBI, I'm not proposing the violent overthrow of the American government. Because I don't want to get in trouble with the FBI, and I'm a Canadian citizen, a Greek citizen, I'm not an American citizen. All right? That's your responsibility. But how do you change it? Well, first of all, I mean, we're in a university, and for me, I'm still a child of the Enlightenment. I believe in education. And I believe that it's very important to educate the great part of the population of people. Democracy is not a goal to achieve, it's a process. It's a culture. It's not regular elections. That's rubbish. That's not democracy. Democracy is all about the citizen. The citizen has rights and the citizen has obligations. And one of the obligations is to be involved in the affairs of the polis, of the city. That's what politics is in Greek. Politismos in Greek also means culture. So the obligation, the duty of the citizen is to be involved. Now, if you take a look at the American electorate, total electorate, what percentage is actually registered to vote? Definitely not 100%. 15%. Well, no, registered to vote. 80, 85%? Registered. What percentage actually then votes? So when a president is elected with 52% of the vote, he's actually being elected by maybe 26% of the population. So if you have 50% of the people who do not vote, you have to ask yourself why. They're alienated. They feel marginalized. They feel that even if I vote, it's not going to make a difference. And I believe that the system, and it's not a conspiracy, it's a system, it's a way of thinking, wants it to be like that. Because that favors certain vested interests. And it's called manufacturing consent. And before Chomsky and Herman wrote the book, it was Walter Lippmann who invented the phrase. And Walter Lippmann was not exactly that sort of Chomskyan radical, but the manufacturing of consent. Now, at home, we do not have a television. I refuse to watch television. But here in the United States, for the last several days, I'm in a hotel, and I turned on, last night after dinner, the conference, I went and I turned on the television. What rubbish. It's absolutely incredible. And whether I'm watching the publicity, whether I'm watching Fox News, MSNBC, etc., all I hear is marketing, the marketing of prejudices. Left-wing, right-wing, the marketing of prejudices. The creation of a certain way of thinking. Now, a university is a place of learning, and your challenge is, what do you do with your students? I mean, there are a number of people here who are young enough to be students, I imagine. What do you do with your students in order to provoke them to have critical thinking? To deconstruct the television, to deconstruct social media. I mean, the great fashion of social media. I do not tweet, and I do not Facebook, and I have no time for it. And I really am not interested in telling people what I had for breakfast this morning and whether I'm traveling tomorrow or not, etc. It's none of their business. All right? And whether you go to the toilet at 8 or 8:15 is none of my business. And I like to sit down with my friends, face to face, over a good drink and a little bit of mezze to eat and so forth. And we scream and we shout at each other. We exchange ideas. That for me is culture. That for me is society. And it's part of an educational process that does not end with school. There's an exchange of ideas. But that's what a citizenship is about. So how do you put an end to it? You begin with education, you begin with promoting the role of the citizen and the responsibility of the citizen. Now, there is an international system, all right, with all of its problems, and multiple fora with their problems. Many of them non-democratic. World Bank, International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, European Commission. I mean, I'm a surgeon. I have seen horrors from what happens through, again, what are really imperial interests. When a country like Burundi in 2003 has structural readjustment imposed on them, what does that mean? You cut the number of civil servants. You have to balance the budget. Who are the first civil servants to go? The teachers, the doctors, and the nurses. And what happens within 6 months? 90% of the hospitals and clinics close down. The number of cesarean sections falls by 80%. Now, in Africa, you do not perform a cesarean section for the convenience of the mother or the gynecologist. You know, I'm leaving on vacation this weekend, so let's do the cesarean section on the Friday before I leave. You do it for medical reasons, and therefore the normal rate of cesarean section is only 7%. So when the absolute number falls by 80%, it means that women are dying at home. Obstructed labor, hemorrhage, sepsis. They don't have access to healthcare any longer. In Greece today, with all of our problems and our crisis, we're having structural readjustment. You go to a hospital and they tell you, bring your own toilet paper, bring your own compresses for change of dressing. Medicines are lacking. And why? Well, because we have to pay off debt to private banks. The crisis of 2008 is not yet over. You have how many millions of people unemployed in the United States still? How many are on long-term unemployment? They've stopped looking for work and therefore they're no longer in the statistics. And yet at the same time, you have a new speculative bubble on Wall Street. The Dow Jones and the Nasdaq are higher today than they were before the crisis of 2008. On what basis? You're not producing more. You have more people unemployed. Speculation. You have another speculative bubble. Okay, we're far from the Middle East, but but there are repercussions on this because structural readjustment is being forced on other people, and throughout the Middle East, throughout Europe, throughout Africa, etc. And you are simply increasing the social injustices of these societies, with the result that people revolt. It even happens in Israel. There was an popular Occupy movement in Israel the last couple of years. Because what was basically a very social democratic and egalitarian society in the 50s and 60s has now become very unequal. And there are 20, 30 families that control most of the Israeli economy. And what was an egalitarian society is no longer the case. People living in Tel Aviv can no longer afford the rents. They demonstrate. And a few people are getting very, very wealthy. And this destabilizes societies. Now, if you're a rich society and you're somewhat destabilized, you manage to muddle through. But if you're a relatively poor society and you're destabilized, you go into crisis mode. And you go into crisis mode, what happens? Were you surprised that Ben Ali was overthrown in Tunisia or Mubarak was overthrown in Egypt? Well, if you follow what's happening in these countries, you will have known that for 10, 12 years before Mubarak was overthrown, there was the Kifaya movement, there was the 6th of April movement, there were hundreds of strikes in the factories. Almost every day there were strikes. For 10 years. That the society was boiling. We're saying, just a moment, it's corruption, it's nepotism. We don't believe in this any longer. The state and its institutions has lost its legitimacy. The same thing in Tunisia. Bouzid, who committed suicide by
Ouazizi.
In Sidi Bouzid by putting himself on fire. University graduate. But he was not the first. He was number 6. There were 5 suicides before him. University graduates that believed that modernity, the Enlightenment argument of get an education and you'll get out of poverty. Well, you've got tens and hundreds of thousands of university graduates that cannot afford to pay the rent.
Chris, I was in Tunisia last week. They said since Mohamed Bouazizi, 400 acts of self-immolation across the Arab world. 400.
Now, what happened in Tunisia was a certain number of factors just happened to come together at that time, at that one suicide by immolation, and people went to the streets and said, that's it. We refuse to continue. It's not new. In Iran, under the Shah, people went into the streets and said, that's it, enough. The army opened fire. People were killed. Next day, funeral. More people went in the streets. You open fire, more dead. The next day, for the funeral, even more people in the streets. Well, finally, when you have millions of people in the streets, they basically said, we refuse to go on. And that's when the regime falls.
Yeah. Charles and then Keenan. Go ahead.
Thank you for a most interesting presentation. Do you have a crystal ball to see what happens in Syria? Do you
I was asked 2-3 years ago, what do I think about what will happen in Syria? The civil war will continue for 20 years at least. That's not a crystal ball. There's a very, very good article in last month's issue of Merib magazine. Merib.
The Middle East Report.
Middle East Report. On Syria. If you do a sociological and economic analysis of Syrian society, it's not a question of Alawi versus Sunni versus Christian versus this. Okay, that's a very Orientalist, racist way of looking at Syrian society. Syrian society is basically regionalist. And you will have 2 villages, they even give an example of 2 villages, both Sunni, all right, and they're only a few kilometers apart. And they don't cooperate. Because that's one region and that's another region. And their loyalties are to the regions. Now, a certain part of the population still supports the regime. Either because they profit from it, through commerce and so forth, and therefore a number of Sunnis, a number of Christians, right? They as well as Alawi, they profit from the regime. Others, because of the development of the civil war, are afraid of the alternative, Jabhat al-Nusra and al-Qaeda. And therefore they look to the regime as the lesser of 2 evils. The country will probably fall to pieces, fiefdoms. And the fiefdoms will not be homogeneous in the sense of sectarianism. Now, some will be, quite simply because that's the way you have the distribution of population. But you will have different fiefdoms under local warlords. And the President of the Republic will simply be one of the warlords. And that can go on for a long time. That was the case of Lebanon. I mean, I lived in Lebanon for 10 years during the Civil War, from 1980 to 1990. And the state was there in name only. The president controlled the area around Babda Presidential Palace. That was it. And the rest of the country was divided into fiefdoms. You had the PLO that created a state within a state, in West Beirut and in the south. They had their Lebanese allies. And West Beirut was mixed. You had Christians, you had Muslims, you had a neighborhood that was Jewish. Many of whom were Jewish women who had married Palestinian men and who in 1948 left. They were refugees. The former PLO Palestinian ambassador to Greece, Samir Abu Ghazali, is Jewish by his mother. His mother is Russian Jewish. His father is Palestinian. He married a Lebanese Shiite woman. And at the same time, the Israeli ambassador in Athens was a Druze Arab. Druze Arab. So the Israeli ambassador was Arab and the Palestinian ambassador was Jewish. All right? And I mean, that's also the Middle East. That's the human reality. And in Lebanon, there is the Cemetery of the Martyrs of the Revolution. It's the only cemetery in the Middle East where you have Jews, Christians, and Muslims buried together. The Palestinian national movement was a secular modernizing movement. And after the Oslo agreements, when Yasser Arafat and company went back to Palestine and the West Bank and Gaza and so forth, again they went bankrupt ideologically. They were incapable of creating the institutions of the state. And corruption, nepotism, and so forth. So, what do you have as a reaction to that? In terms of nationalism, anti-colonialism, etc.? Hamas. And in the beginning of Hamas, 1987-88, it was actually Israeli authorities that helped to distribute the Hamas literature and brochures and pamphlets and so forth. It's called divide and conquer. So if we build up Hamas, maybe we'll weaken the PLO. And then when Hamas, of course, becomes even more radical than the PLO, it is, well, the same sort of phenomenon as Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen. The CIA have a name for it. It's called blowback. I have a different name for it. It's called the Frankenstein syndrome. You create a monster, whether it's called Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden or etc., and then you're surprised when you lose control of the monster.
Keenan?
So, kind of, especially in the context of your talk, I see the Arab Spring, or at least I saw it, as a rejection of this post-colonial toxic society that you talked about. And the people face the choice whether kind of pan-Arab ideology had been exhausted, that secular ideology gone, Islamism or democracy. But my question actually really isn't about which one they chose or kind of why, but why has the post-colonial state proven so resilient? Not in any sort of like state capacity way, but in the way that they are maintaining power.
Right. Because part of it is simply the logic of capitalism, especially when it's state capitalism. I mean, you could make the argument the Soviet Union was not communist, it was state capitalist. And members of the party simply replaced the old aristocracy and bourgeoisie. So you had a new class in power. And it lasted for 80 years. People's China. Is there anything left of socialism in China? It's the most savage capitalism on the earth today. But what do you have? You have a party of millions of people, and you have the sons and daughters of the top party members who are millionaires, and who drive Ferrari cars and what have you, etc., etc. In the Arab world, the same thing. You have an elite in power. They represent certain vested interests. And the people who do business with them, foreigners, also represent vested interests. So I will not only sell you Coca-Cola or Fanta or mobile telephones, and iPads and so forth, or Mercedes-Benz automobiles. I will also train your police and your military and your this and your that, and I will invest, etc., and I will support those structures. The result is these states continue. Now, I believe that we're rapidly approaching a crunch, which is why I said that for me, Sykes-Picot is dead. And in the next 20 years, it's not just a question of Syria. Iraq is in the middle of a civil war. And it has been for the last 10 years. And I'm not surprised. I was in Baghdad 1 week after the city fell to replace the Red Cross medical coordinator who had been there during the war. And I stayed for 6 weeks during the looting and all of the rubbish. And every day I had 4 American military doctors with a Marine colonel, Task Force Fedger, who came by my Red Cross office and so forth. It was the only place they could get a cold beer. And at one point, I told them, so what are you going to do when the civil war begins? Huh? What civil war? I said, well, it's going to happen. And it's not Sunni against Shiite. It's going to be Sunni against Sunni. It's going to be Shiite against Shiite. It's going to be Sunni against Shiite. It's going to be Arab against Kurd. And the closer the Kurds get to independence, it's going to be Kurd against Kurd. Because Barzani and Talabani have already fought each other in a civil war. And it was not the surge that turned around the insurgency. It was al-Sahwa. It was Sunni Arabs who refused al-Qaeda and therefore allied themselves to the United States. They stopped shooting at Americans and they allied themselves to the Americans. Because they were simply choosing the lesser evil. They didn't want al-Qaeda. And that's what turned around the insurgency, not the surge of extra troops. Of course it's a civil war. And the civil war continues. There are bombs in Baghdad and Mosul and Bas every day. It's not finished. It's not because it's not on your headline news that all of a sudden, it's nice and peaceful and democratic. It's not the case. In the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to see at least this part, of the Middle East fall apart. And I believe that they're going to redraw the map. So Sykes-Picot is dead. And in the next 20 years, and maybe the new map will have a closer relationship to the human reality on the ground. I don't know. In any case, there's the apocrypha anecdote of, some people say it was a journalist, others say it was Kissinger, who asked Zhou Enlai, the Chinese prime minister, what he thought about the French Revolution 200 years later. And he said, it's too early to judge. And you have to come from a civilization that's 5,000 years old to be able to say, 2 centuries, it's too early to judge. The Middle East has millennia of history. And don't forget, in the year 1800, the economic center of the world was in Asia. China and India represented 75% of manufacturing in the world in 1800. And that has always been the case. The economic center of the world has always been in Asia because that's where the people were, that's the demography. It's the last 200 years of Western dominance that is the aberration. And today we're simply going back to the way that humanity has usually lived. That economic dominance is in Asia because that's where half, if not more than half the population of the world live. So what happens in the next 20 years, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, the succession in Saudi Arabia. After Saud, we've had several brothers and half-brothers. Well, the half-brothers are running out. They're all into their 70s and 80s, and you have 5,000 princes of the next generation. Who is going to be king amongst the 5,000? So even there, the question of legitimacy, the legitimacy of the state, legitimacy of the succession, because it's not been from father to son, it's from brother to brother. Once you start going to the next generation, you're going to see a lot of vested interests involved. Oil companies, the Pentagon, etc. To help determine who remains in power. And those vested interests, as I say, I mean, it goes from Mercedes-Benz to Coca-Cola to iPad and to oil. And they will try to influence the evolution. The people will have their own ideas of what they want for their future. Whether for the time being it's still Islam, political Islam, which obviously also does not have the solution to their economic problems and development problems. And therefore, will they swing back to some form of a secular ideology? We're going to simply have to sit back and let history play itself out.
Chris, thank you for being with us today. Appreciate it very much.